both the Americans and the Europeans know that you can't make this into a $500 billion war. Because let's say it's a $500 billion war. Then there's the 700 billion for reconstruction, which we're now saying 1.2 trillion. Who's going to come up with this money? And to answer your question in one sentence, Ramananda, it's not the Americans and the Europeans who do reconstruction, it's the Chinese under Belt and Road Initiative.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Welcome to the gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very, very special guest today is Dr. Amit Gupta. Professor Gupta wears many hats. He's currently a senior advisor to the Forum of Federations in Ottawa. He has served as senior faculty and visiting fellow at top-notch institutions like the United States Air Force Air War College in Alabama and the Sandia National Labs, to name just a few. And his areas of expertise and interest span global security, conflicts, popular culture, politics, and sports. But today we're going to be discussing the two main conflicts in the world and how that impacts the US elections. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. I appreciate your taking time out for this.
Thank you once again, Ramananda, for inviting me to continue the conversation.
It's always a delight. So let's start with the current conflict in West Asia. It's, I think, fresh in the minds, particularly, what the way Israel sort of started, bumping off all the Hezbollah leaders one by one, and the incredibly, interesting ways in which they did it. But what I'm trying to understand is that, there are people who say that Israel's main ambition is to sort of, do a regime change in Iran, and Hezbollah is just a small thing in the way of that. Where exactly do you think this conflict is headed right now?
Look, let me put it this way. Good things have happened for Israel. Not so good things have happened for Israel. The good things is they managed to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah. They were able to use the pagers and the walkie talkies to inflict a tactical loss on Hezbollah. I don't think it's taken away from Hezbollah's full military capabilities. That
Mm-hmm.
part is there. Um, the problem for the Israelis is as follows. One, they no longer can say that they can defend themselves. Because if you look at the Iranian attack, the first missile attack, and now the second missile attack, the US has been involved in defending Israel. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing is, yes, you killed Hassan Nasrallah, but you can't get rid of Hezbollah, just like you can't get rid of Hamas until you actually go into Lebanon and wage a full fledged ground invasion. You can bomb people till you've run out of ammunition, but at the end of the day, it has to be a land invasion, which is what Hezbollah is waiting for. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the second part. The third part on the regime change in Iran is, and this is the sort of very naive belief in Washington, some European capitals, so on, that if you get rid of the Ayatollahs, Iran becomes this wonderful liberal democracy like Belgium. No, it won't. The Iranians are extremely nationalistic people, and whatever they may think of the Ayatollahs, they're not going to agree to regime change and things like this. They will fight it quite viciously, if I may put it that way. And I think your viewers should remember this, that George W. Bush went and labeled Iran
Mm-hmm.
as the axis of evil. This was almost 25 years ago. What do you think they've been doing for 25 years? They've been
Mm-hmm.
preparing for this. And the one thing they've shown, again, we're not yet getting the complete intelligence on what happened in the second Iranian missile strikes, but it's very clear quite a few of their missiles got through, that they hit
Right.
the airbase, they hit other targets. And the question then becomes, what can they do in round three? And of course, the Israelis will react and they will try and do something as well. So, I mean, let me put it this way: Israel's problem now is one, it can no longer say that it is the sole guarantor of its own security. Two, it's fighting a war with Hamas, a war with Hezbollah, a war with the Iranians, and a war with the Houthis. How many wars can you do? And I'll add one little statistical trivia for your audience. After October 7th, 470,000 Israelis left the
Hmm.
country. Jews, okay, not Palestinians. Jews
Right.
left the country. And the numbers are more. The Wall Street Journal, which is a very pro Israeli paper, wrote a really good article on this and said now a lot of the high tech crowd in Israel is wanting to leave. And what they said is it's not that large a high tech crowd, it's only about 400,000. And if a chunk of that leaves, Israel will face not only a population drain, but a brain drain. Okay.
Hmm.
So you've really got two problems here. You've got the population brain drain, and you've got four wars with no end in sight. And just yesterday or day before, the Israelis started up operations in northern Gaza again. So how long can this continue? And really, I don't see any planning for how to make the peace.
Hmm. But
Because you're not, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you for a second. What struck me was that I would have thought the Americans would have learned their lesson by now that you can't do a regime change from the top. I mean, Afghanistan is a clear example of that. So,
It's look, the problem in the United States is that for some reason the diplomats, the military officers, so on, do not really have a good grasp of what goes on in foreign countries. In other words, look, America lost its Iran experts with the revolution. There are very
mhm,
few Americans who go to Iran. And if they do, the Iranians pick them up for all kinds of reasons and harass them. Okay.
right.
So you don't have Iran experts. You don't really have real Houthi experts. Where is the American expert on Hamas? They all claim to know Hamas, but where is the expert? So a lot of this is based on the idea if we can cut a deal with somebody, we'll be able to get our political outcomes. And there's a long history of this, Ramananda. Admiral Darlan was assassinated by friendly forces to the Allies so that they could change the outcome of the Second World War. Same thing happened with DM in in South Vietnam. They got rid of him
Hmm.
because they felt that he was allowing the North Vietnamese to make progress in the insurgency. Now, you can't do a top-down one, and until and unless you have people who are really versed in area studies, you will never be able to understand it. I mean, I'll make a plug for Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'll probably be one of the few people who does that on your show. But when I did my master's there many years ago, we had a professor who had spent 10 years in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. He knew Central Asia. And he used to tell us look, there's a huge difference between white Soviet Union and non-white Soviet Union. And non-white Soviet Union is well fed and they're having children and so on. And all that has come to roost. So the real problem is it's a bit of an unrealistic policy. There's also the
Hmm.
Israel lobby in the United States, which wants both the Republicans and the Democrats to support
Okay.
Netanyahu's policies. Flip side to this is, let's be clear, there's a lot of people in America who don't agree with these policies. And you've seen
Hmm.
that in the demonstrations in universities, you've seen that in the peace demonstrations. And by the way, I'll just add one thing to that. To suggest that every Jew in America is blindly supporting Israel is just silly. There's a huge group of Jewish activists who feel that things should be different, that what Netanyahu is doing is wrong. And that's like
Hmm.
any community in the world. All communities in the world have seven different opinions on an issue. I'll
Right.
leave it at that.
Hmm. But there also seems to be a lot of resentment across the world, even from people who would normally support Israel,
Yeah.
given what they've done in Palestine. I mean, in the West, in the Gaza Strip. Now, how is that likely to play out? Because I'm not sure the ICJ has that much teeth to do much as long as the Western countries sort of pull themselves. But
I think it's been a blow to Western soft power, number one, because remember, it's the West which screams about the rules based international order, the rule of law, the ICJ. And I said this in February in Amsterdam. I gave a talk at the Free University there. And I said, you Dutch are so fond of cycling. You tell me that 10 kilometers of cycling a day is grocery shopping for you. I said, I'm very impressed. Your prime minister could have got on his bicycle, gone to the Peace Palace, which is not that far from the prime minister's office, and handed over a complaint at the gate in front of full media coverage saying we want to bring Israel to the International Court of Justice. He didn't
right.
do that. Nobody in the West did that. Well, you lost soft PowerPoints. On the other hand, South Africa did. And South Africa came out looking very good as a result of that. So that's the first part. And the second part for the Israelis is look, if this continues, my worry for the Israelis is they will start learning that they're being treated the way the South Africans were in the 1980s. That if you met a South African and you didn't meet them in India, you didn't meet them in Philippines, you only met them in Europe or in the United States. What reasonable people with a conscience did was they said, "Oh, you're South African," and you turned your back and you walked away because to talk to them meant that you were condoning their behavior. To argue with them
Hmm.
was pointless. And that is, I think, the thing that the Israelis have to worry about in the long term. That does this resentment get consolidated into a anti-Israel sentiment?
Hmm. I would have ideally liked to have discussed all three conflicts with you, but I don't know whether we have that kind of time because
Sure.
the South China Sea will take an entire interview by
Yeah.
itself. But would I be right to say that that this conflict in West Asia, the events that are happening there, has somehow overshadowed what's been going on in Ukraine, and that anyway there's been a lot of reader fatigue about what's been going on there, and people tend to forget that Putin has been seriously threatening, he's revamped his nuclear policy and
Right.
all kinds of things. So where do we stand vis-a-vis that?
Okay. Look, the Ukrainians have suffered heavy casualties. Okay.
Hmm.
The last number that Zelensky gave was 31,000 killed. But that was a long
Right.
time ago. And he never said how many were wounded. But what your viewers should remember is being wounded in a conflict is not that you got shot in the arm or something. It's that your arm got blown off, your leg got blown off. So you're no good for fighting anymore. Okay? Or
Right.
you've now got a metal plate in your head. And the casualty numbers, the total casualty numbers, there was one report out of the New York Times, then it got shut down, was it maybe 500,000? Okay,
Hmm.
the other thing to remember is the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43.
Okay.
And right, and war is a young person's game, as we all know. Right. When you start sending out 43-year-olds to fight, you're not doing yourself any favors. Having said that, the 43-year-olds have fought extremely well. So I should
Hmm.
make a case for ageism in that sense. But the fact is, look, Ukraine has suffered heavy casualties. They've been subsidized to the tune of nearly $300 billion, which is not going to happen to any other country in a modern war. Israel's being subsidized also, otherwise, this war wouldn't happen.
Right.
Three, there's a demographic disaster in Ukraine. Ukraine, when it became independent, had 51 million people. By the time the war started, the official number was about 44 million, maybe 42 million, because there's a very large Ukrainian diaspora working in service industries across the world.
Hmm.
That number was supposed to come down to 35 million by 2050. It is
Oh, okay.
already at 35 million. And now the new US Census Bureau estimate is that Ukraine's population will be 30 million by 2050. So essentially,
Hmm.
in a 60-year period, their population has gone down by about 20 million people. But the other thing is, Ramananda, it's an inverted pyramid. Okay, that they have very few young people. They have a lot of people in the age group 35 to 70. And by the time they get down to 30 million, that age group will be 45 to 70.
Okay.
So, right. So, what you have is a demographic disaster. You also have an economic disaster. The World Bank estimated in 2023 411 billion to rebuild Ukraine. This year in March, they said no, 486 billion. That
Wow,
number I'm
that's
sure will go up. I'm sure will go up. And Zelensky says 700 billion. Now, I've been writing on this and people don't like to hear it. That means let's go with Zelensky's figure, which I suspect is more accurate. That
hmm
means the West will have to fork out 20 to 30 billion a year for 20 years to do meaningful economic reconstruction in Ukraine. Okay, not this that, okay, we built a bridge and we built a highway. Congratulations. Because that's not going to bring people back. If you want people back, they have to come back to homes, they have to come back to the proper kind of power grid, these kinds of things. They have to come back to jobs. And that means a solid investment. And the sense I get is the day the Ukraine war ends, people will forget about Ukraine. Much in the way they forgot about Cambodia, much in the way they forgot about Vietnam, much in the way they've forgotten about Afghanistan.
hmm
So
I
it,
was
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm
No,
done.
I was just
Sorry.
hmm. I was just thinking that there was something I was watching the other day which said that if you were to just follow the money, um, who will do all this reconstruction? It will mostly be the US or some Western allies. So they're going to make money doing this. Second, the money that they're paying for weapons, again, it doesn't go to Ukraine, it goes back to their own countries, right? So where exactly does Zelensky stand in all this? I mean, where is he headed for? He keeps on begging for the right to actually use those weapons, the long distance weapons against Russia. But I assume the West is too scared that Russia will see it as a hostile act by NATO and start using nuclear weapons. So,
Okay, there are several points there. First is the Russians are not bluffing about using nuclear weapons. This
mhm,
is again a belief in the West. In the days of mutual assured destruction in the Cold War, the Russians never said we believe in mutual assured destruction. They said if we have to use nuclear weapons, we will use nuclear weapons. And it's the same thing. Putin said if you start doing things where it becomes very clear to us that American or Swedish or British people are firing Storm Shadow missiles at us, it's NATO's committing an act of aggression. So that's problem one, that you don't want it to escalate. Problem two
mhm,
is we don't know how long Zelensky is going to last in all this. Remember, he stopped legally, his presidency ended in May this year. They haven't had an election. Whatever you can say about the Russians, they did have an election. So they can always say Putin is the legitimate representative of the Russian people. That's the second problem. We don't know what the sentiment is. Large numbers of young people are running away from Ukraine. But to answer your point on all the money that's gone, absolutely. Most of that money has gone back to Western arms manufacturers. And then there's been fraud. Um, a lot of the weapons given to the Ukrainians have been surplus old Soviet legacy systems out of Eastern Europe, T 72 tanks, stuff like this, very large
mhm.
numbers. Okay. And that stuff isn't really very good in combat anymore, as has been shown by the way both Ukraine and Russia have damaged things. And I'll say one last thing on this. NATO talks a big talk, NATO is not delivering. I gave a talk in Portugal. The Portuguese gave three Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Ukraine is bigger than Germany, okay, or about the
Mhm.
size of Germany. What are you going to do with three Leopard tanks? And the Portuguese deal with the Germans was, we will give these three tanks if you maintain all our tank fleet for free. This is how deals are being cut. This is not a serious military effort on the part of NATO except to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian,
Right.
which is very sad for the Ukrainians, I think.
I guess they're just being used as a pawn as for a larger sort of conflict, which is what most people say. But that brings me to the Europeans. There's been a surge of the right wing coming to power in France and Germany and other places. How much of that is due to the fact that many people think that what, we have problems of our own? Why the hell are we funding a war somewhere else?
Absolutely, because look, the right wing feels there should be a entente with Russia. There's no point
Hmm.
in having this war. The right wing also recognizes that the European welfare state, which was high levels of healthcare, high levels of free education, is collapsing now. I mean, you go to Britain, and the British still think they have an empire, and the British still think that they run India. It's very
Hmm.
funny to sit in conferences in Britain and hear them talk. But the point is, the British have three problems. They want to have a big defense component. They want to rebuild their national healthcare system, which is collapsing, and they want to rebuild their national infrastructure. You can't
Right.
do all three. You can only do one out of three. And if you talk to the British people, they want the healthcare system more than anything else. See,
Hmm.
it's the same thing across Europe. And the other problem across Europe is nobody wants to fight. Olaf Schultz and his Sancho Panza, Ursula von der Leyen, keep talking about German remilitarization. Where are the people? Nobody in Germany
Right.
wants to join the military. So
Hmm.
all this big talk that we're going to remilitarize isn't going to happen.
Hmm.
So my
Now,
my own
sorry.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no, no,
No, no, go ahead. I'm sorry, I keep
no,
interrupting you.
no, no. You don't interrupt me. But look. My sense is the it doesn't matter who comes in America. Eventually, and it looks like the Russians are now really pounding the Ukrainians, taking territory, so on. NATO is going to have a very hard choice in about 6 months. What does it do? And the Russians, their objectives seem to be limited. The objectives seem to be expanding now. They're talking about taking more areas of Ukraine. They may even go all the way to Odessa, which is a Russian city.
Right.
If they take Odessa, they've cut off Ukraine from the sea.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So, what is NATO going to do? And NATO can't. J.D. Vance wrote an article on this in the New York Times. He said the numbers don't add up. Look, Ukraine needs about 7 million shells a year, artillery
Hmm.
shells. The Americans are making about 300,000. They want to take it up to a million. Where do the other 6 million come from? Well, India is selling a lot of artillery shells around the world right now.
That's right.
Congratulations, right?
Hmm.
So Atmanirbhar is having its payback, so to speak, or its payoff.
Hmm.
So that is there. But at the end of the day, both the Americans and the Europeans know that you can't make this into a $500 billion war. Because let's say it's a $500 billion war. Then there's the 700 billion for reconstruction, which we're now saying 1.2 trillion. Who's going to come up with this money? And to answer your question in one sentence, Ramananda, it's not the Americans and the Europeans who do reconstruction, it's the Chinese under Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
Yeah. And they
That's
come
interesting
across looking
because
as heroes. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, but now that we're talking about the Chinese as well, but India too has been sort of trying to position itself not as a mediator but as a sort of facilitator for peace talks in both these conflicts. You had Modi traveling to Moscow, yeah, then he went to Kiev, and of course the Chinese have put forward their plans. Um, how exactly does that sort of work out? If do these plans actually have some kind of a substance? Can they really play a role?
See, I unfortunately, let me put it this way: the Ukrainians have fought bravely. The Ukrainians have fought well. The Ukrainians now probably, this is my assumption, are going to have to settle to a Russian uh, dominated peace plan or a
Hmm.
Russian dictated peace plan. That is the first part in it. I think the Chinese will come in with money. They're the only people who will. I think the Europeans will say, oh, here's 5 billion, here's 10 billion. If you have a bill of 700 billion, 10 billion from you
Right.
will do nothing. Okay? Just
Mm-hmm.
as 10 billion from the Americans will do nothing, the Chinese will rebuild. And I think that's a very important thing. I think there's one more thing which is very interesting to tie this back to the pagers and the walkie talkies and so on. There's an awful lot of people around the world now who are saying perhaps we should not be buying Western cell phones and Western walkie talkies. We should be buying
Absolutely.
Chinese because that stuff is not
Mm-hmm.
going to blow up. Hmm. And this, I mean, let's face facts. There's good reasons for that now. So I would not be surprised if the Chinese essentially come up with a $20 billion plan. Remember, they offered Pakistan, which is an economic basket case, 60 billion. Pakistanis brought it to 48 billion. Realistically, it should have been about 20 billion. They couldn't
Okay.
absorb the money. Imagine if
Mm-hmm.
they offer 60 billion to the Ukrainians, who actually could do reconstruction with it.
Right. Um, yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. But um, let's come to the other interesting point here. You have the elections coming up in the US. How do both these conflicts sort of, help either Trump or Kamala Harris?
If there's a war with Iran and United States gets involved, it's going to be hugely unpopular.
Okay.
It is. Americans are tired of war. We've been fighting a war for 25 years now. People want to get on with their lives, and this is not an existential threat to the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
9/11 was an existential threat. You and I were both there in 9/11, so we know what it was like. Um, the It'll help Trump. And Trump will give one of his simplistic answers. If I was there, it wouldn't have happened. Now, there's no way that you can prove or disprove that. And his next line is going to be, and if I'm there, I'll shut it all down in 24 hours, which again cannot be proved or disproved. Problem is
Mm-hmm.
for Kamala Harris, because if this becomes a war, the Democrats become warmongers. And remember,
Right.
there is a section of the Democratic Party which is very upset with Joe Biden. They call him Genocide Joe because of what his support for Israel has led to. And
Mm-hmm.
those people, they are crucial voters in swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, so on. And I'll add one thing, Ramananda. Don't look at the polls because the polls, as we saw in India in the last elections also, don't tell the truth. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The polls in America suggested that Hillary was going to win by a good margin. She lost. The polls in America said that Biden would win. Well, he did win, but he won by 77,000 votes across 3 or 4 states, which is not that much in a country of 330 million people. So I think that part is there. And also, there's one more thing. In the 2020 elections, 55% of white women voted for Trump. This is despite all the sexism charges against Trump. And you need to ask, or your audience needs to ask itself why that happened. I mean, I can
Mm-hmm.
give answers if you like, but it's on a razor's edge. It could go either way. October is a long month. We're just in the first week of October now. And a war would be bad. A war would be bad because war means casualties. And there's one thing people forget about Iran.
Okay.
When I was teaching at the Air War College, people would be like, Baghdad is for pussies, real men do Tehran. And I'd say, okay, real men, here's a map of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Look at it. Number one, it's 3 times the size of Iraq in terms of population. It's 80 million people. Okay. So maybe
Right.
more than 3 times the size. Two, it's very rugged, hilly country. You can't go across hilly country in the way you go across the plains of the desert or through the desert. And three, they've been planning for 20 years to fight.
Mm-hmm.
They this idea that you're going to attack them and they're going to take down the Ayatollahs and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, I don't think so. Not if there's an attack from outside. As you just said, it'll have to come from inside. And there is enough resentment against these forces in Iran, but those people are not going to stand up, much in the same way there are Israelis who don't support Netanyahu. But they're not going to stand up and say we're against Netanyahu, given everything that's happened in the last year.
Hmm. But I was reading somewhere, I think the Federation of American Scientists, they had put out a report recently saying that Iran is what, barely 7 to 10 days away, if they really wanted to make a sort of a nuclear weapon. And and Israel obviously cannot allow that to happen. So what are Israel's options if actually these people push? Will they go ahead and try another strike at the Iranian nuclear facilities? And if they do, I mean, where does that take the world?
Look, George Walker Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden have all said we won't allow an Iranian nuclear bomb. Question is, how do you do it?
Hmm.
And going and bombing facilities, let's say they've actually built a bomb, you may not be able to get hold of the fissile material. Attacking the nuclear facilities leads to radioactive waste going into the air, which is not a bright thing to do. Okay.
Right.
And the point the late Hassan Nasrallah made and the Iranians make is look, we have a nuclear bomb. We can hit Domona, which is the Israeli nuclear power plant, and we can release
Hmm.
radiation. So
Right.
this is not a good idea. And also, we don't know what help the Russians are giving the Iranians now.
Hmm.
We do know that they've boosted Iranian air defenses, so it's not going to be as easy as it was maybe 5 years ago. And I wouldn't say it would have been easy even 5 years ago. The other thing is we don't know what kind of nuclear aid and assistance the Russians are giving Iran. I just wrote an article saying the Russians have been very scrupulous on abiding with non proliferation treaties. I mean, I'll give you
Hmm.
three examples from India. Both the INS Chakra, the Akula boat, and the Charlie nuclear boat that were given to the Navy,
Right.
they were given under very strict conditions. You could not put Indian nuclear weapons on them. They'd made that clear. You could use them only in very specific contexts. And if you look at the Kalpakam nuclear reactor in Tamil Nadu, what they've said is the spent fuel will be taken back to Russia for reprocessing. We won't allow the Indians to do it. They
Hmm.
on BrahMos, they didn't allow BrahMos to go beyond the range of the missile technology control regime restrictions. Now, all
Right.
this is going to change because look at the sanctions which are being put on them. Look at the way they're being treated by the West. So they're now saying we're a Eurasian country. They've become buddies with the North Koreans. They become buddies with the Iranians. Who knows what the Iranians are getting? And again, a
Hmm.
lot of what you see in the Western press is to give a particular line. It's not what I would call objective reporting.
Hmm. We seem to be sort of running a bit short of time, but I have
Sure.
a question which has always been sort of bothering me. I had a guest just some time back who argued that the Democrats have been reluctantly allowing Netanyahu to continue whatever he's doing, and because of the Jewish lobby. But if Trump comes in, I mean, he's going to be gung ho and saying that, yeah, go ahead, get these guys. Is that a right assessment to make?
Okay, I'm going to say one thing. The Republican Party is not doing itself any favors. Lindsey Graham went and said, oh, they can even use nuclear weapons to finish the job. Well, that's genocide. And Lindsey Graham is an Air Force colonel and a lawyer. So, as a lawyer, he
Hmm.
should know what the legal definition of genocide is. But then again, he can't be a very good lawyer if he's having to work as an Air Force JAG. He would have been in the private sector making millions. That would be my first criticism there. And Namrata Randhava, who goes by the alias Nikki Haley, is such a barbarian that she's writing on artillery shells, finish them. Now,
Hmm.
you tell me, you've covered enough wars in your time. Have you ever seen a politician do that? In the worst conflicts between India and Pakistan, has any politician gone to the border and written on an artillery shell, finish them? These people are talking in a way. that is going to keep hurting American soft power. And with
Sorry.
Trump, sorry, no, not at all. With Trump, I'll
No, no,
just
go
say
ahead.
one thing. With Trump, Ramananda, expect the unexpected. You never know. He keeps saying, I'll let the Israelis finish the job. But if he sees financial gain in something here, he's going to say,
Right.
no, we're going to put an end to this. So I wouldn't be that certain about the way he's thinking. And if the Democrats call this reluctant support, I hate to think what full support would be, because
Mm-hmm.
reluctant support has led to a lot of deaths in the Gaza Strip. And that's I think, I mean, I've written on this. I've written articles which I can send to you. I wrote an article in 2016 that the younger generation doesn't is not going to have the same pro-Israeli sentiments that the Biden people or the Trump generation have. They believe in social justice, so on. And you will see a normalization of the relationship with Israel. Well, we saw this the minute Gaza happened. You saw the protests erupt across campuses. Now,
Mm-hmm.
those people are the future voters. Trump and
Mm-hmm.
Biden are the past voters in one sense. So I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to look at that and see where America will be 10 years from now. Right now, it may be reluctantly supporting. 10 years from now, as more of these people who have become politically active come into politics, become members of civil society, they may say something very different.
Mm-hmm.
And
You
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, there was one argument being made that Blinken made so many sort of trips to negotiate a peace treaty to East Asia, and none of them worked out. Does that undermine the democratic position in some way, or does it just show that some kind of a hypocrisy on the part of the U.S. where they're pretending to do a peace talk and at the same time telling the Israelis, "Go ahead, we'll give you money to bash these guys."
The the UN resolution that the Americans wanted was condemn Hamas and have a ceasefire. And nobody in the UN agreed to that. The one that they agreed to was the Jordanian one. And what kind of country is Jordan? It's a small, not very powerful
Mm-hmm.
military. I can go down the list. But 121 nations to the 10 who voted against it went with the Jordanian resolution, which said, we're not condemning anybody, we just want a ceasefire. That was a slap on the
Okay.
face of Blinken, Biden, Harris, all these people. Because the
Mm-hmm.
world said, we don't buy your narrative. Sorry, we can see on TikTok what is happening. And remember this, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all the British newspapers, the last great imaginary empire, all these people actually are pushing a particular line. They're not unbiased. It's the unbiased stuff is coming on TikTok, Telegram, so on. And young people watch that. We've had this conversation before. Young people don't read the New York Times. Young
Right.
people don't watch network television. And
Mm-hmm.
what you've seen, and I would say this for any country that goes to war, before you go to war, make sure that your narrative is on TikTok.
With that, I'm afraid we must close this particular
Sure.
interview. But I look forward to inviting you again to talk about the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, because that's something again that's sort of you know uh, becoming a bit of a mess out there. So perhaps we could get a
Can 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 I take 1 minute to say
sure,
that?
please.
Because I'm
Yeah.
sure your audience will like, okay, here's what the Indians need to remember.
Mm-hmm.
When Galwan happened, 20 Indian soldiers or 24 Indian soldiers were killed.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump said, I am happy to mediate between the Chinese and the Indians. Mediate means I'm taking a neutral position. And your
Right.
dear friends in the Quad, the Australians, who again are very expressive people, and the Japanese, said, this is a serious situation of concern. Nobody said, we support the Indians in this conflict. Though, if you
Mm-hmm.
claim there is a Quad, it would be nice to hear that. Second thing is, the Australians already said Yeah, we're buying nuclear submarines, but we're not showing up to fight in Taiwan. So what are you going to do with your nuclear submarines? And the Japanese are too old. The Japanese don't have a young enough population to go and wage a war in the way they did in World War II. Okay,
Hmm.
so Indo-Pacific, and Ramananda, China's largest trading partner today is ASEAN, with $880 billion in trade. The last time I looked. Okay, so it's not the EU. EU is second. It's not the US. It's third. The Chinese are delinking. The Chinese used to have 1.2 or 1.3 trillion in US Treasury bills. They have 700 and something billion in US Treasury bills now. They've shrunk it by about 500 billion. They are
Hmm.
decoupling because they've seen what's happened with Russia. Okay. So it's all very good to talk about Indo Pacific without looking at the big picture. And add to this, thank you, Israel. You've just made Huawei phones look a whole lot better. You've made Xiaomi look a whole lot better. Because I know for a fact that if I criticize my government, this damn thing is not going to blow up in my face.
True. Right. Thank you so much. It was a
No,
pleasure
thank
having you
you.
with us as always. And I look forward to, like I said, expanding on our discussion on South China Sea because certain things that I heard at a conference recently I found very intriguing. So once again, thank you so much for joining us and I look forward to having you again.
Absolutely, Raman. And then I'll just say this. Think of what a great growth industry the Indo Pacific has become. Conferences, trips abroad, all kinds of people meeting. There's money in it. So never mock an Indo Pacific conference, even though it will achieve nothing. Thank you so much. As always, a genuine pleasure. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks in New Delhi.
Absolutely. You most certainly will. Thank you again. That was Dr. Amit Gupta, Senior Advisor to the Forum of Federations and one of finest sort of political and strategic analysts I've ever spoken to, talking to us about the Ukraine and East Asian conflicts and how that sort of plays out over the year, end of the year, and on the US elections. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.